So I think the answer is diversity. It has to be solar, but also wind, but also storage, but also high voltage DC lines, like all the things. I really believe that it's the diversity of not just one type of resource, but all the types that are really going to get us to the more reliable grid, especially with this massive load increase coming at us.
Welcome to the Intergenius Podcast with Joe Patch IV.
I want to welcome everyone back to another episode of the Intergenius Podcast. Today, I'm super excited to have Carrie Zalewski with me on today. She's the Vice President of Transmission and Markets at the American Clean Power Association. Carrie, thank you for coming on. I appreciate making the time.
Thanks for having me, Joe. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Well, as I was telling Carrie before we went on air today, I'm stoked. Okay. She's an engineer with a law degree. Okay. These don't grow on trees. So I'm super excited. Give us a little bit of background. How did you kind of get to where you are today, but by way of, why engineering? What kind of engineering did you study in particular? And then why law? And then how do you marry the two together? I think it's a fascinating position that you're in today.
Yeah, thanks for the question. The real answer is that I come from a line of engineers. My dad was an engineer, my brothers were engineers. And so they went to school for it. But what I didn't have in my family were lawyers.
Okay.
So at a very young age, for some reason, I'm not sure what, maybe I saw a TV show, I announced that I wanted to be a lawyer, like age 8, age 10. And I just kind of stuck with it. Now, obviously, you need an undergrad degree to go to law school. So I had to do something. And my brother, who was older than me, was at the University of Illinois studying engineering, who eventually went on to get his PhD in mechanical engineering. So he absolutely loves the field. Talked to me about how it was the greatest thing to study ever. And said that if you're going to go to U of I, you might as well do engineering because it's very rigorous. And so that's what I did because he said it was a good idea. So I went to the University of Illinois and studied, it was at the time it was called general engineering. It's now called integrated systems engineering. And really it's kind of like using an applied engineering. So using thermodynamics, using control system and trying to apply it in a business setting. We ultimately do at the end of our senior year, we do a senior design project. I did really love it. I had to work, really hard. I appreciated the problem solving aspect, sitting in the classroom with some of the smartest students, in the near area. So I really did enjoy the challenge. So graduate from undergrad, go on to law school. Again, no lawyers that I'm talking to. I'm not really sure what I want to do with my law degree. I had a professor talk to me to your question, Joe, about going from engineering to law. The first thing he noted, he said, you should go into patent law because there's a separate bar for the patent bar to appear before the patent office, the U.S. Patent Office. And the only way to sit for the patent bar is to have a certain type of degree, a technical degree like engineering. So
interesting. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, so people kept talking to me about it, like you should go into patent law, and I took a patent law class, but then I externed at a law firm in Chicago doing patent law, and didn't like it. So just to give you a sense of what it entails to be a patent lawyer, and look, I have so much respect for patent attorneys. I love the idea of helping new innovations get patented. I'm all about the mission, but really especially as an extern, what I was doing was looking at voluminous pages of patent applications, thousands of pages, and trying to figure out how this one device was just different enough from this other device to gain a patent before the patent office.
Right. Wow.
And so it's a lot of doc review and comparing this from that. And then you have to also bill hours to figure out a way to bill the client. I also worked for a couple years at in law school at a trademark little law firm operation. And so I wasn't excited about it. So graduate law school. I just was looking for a job, and I first landed at a law firm doing litigation. I'm glad I had the experience, but it's another one of those life lessons of what I don't want to do. Grueling hours, again, trying to capture your time And then litigation is in the area I was in, it was a lot of just a lot of competition, and it just wasn't, I don't think it was using my interests and my skill set
Mhm.
very well.
Right.
So, I ended up applying for the Illinois Department of Transportation. So it's a state agency. They
DOT.
had an
Yeah.
DOT. They had an
Yeah.
opening for an attorney. Just to backtrack a little, I actually worked as an intern at IDOT, Illinois Department of Transportation,
Oh.
IDOT, in college because I grew up in this rural town in Illinois and there wasn't a lot of job opportunities, but they did have an IDOT office there. So I could go home after my freshman year of college and I
Mm.
worked at this IDOT office doing engineering stuff just to get some
Okay.
experience. So I knew what it was like, and I liked the people, and I liked, the mission. I liked working with engineers in that space. So this position came open at IDOT, and I started there. And within just a couple weeks of starting there, there was a very senior attorney who handled environmental compliance work. So
Oh,
if you think about it, you are building roads at IDOT, and you're disrupting dirt and sediment, and you're near water sources. And so you
yeah.
have to really make sure that you are in compliance with
Yeah.
environmental standards. Okay,
Right.
so he leaves suddenly. My general
Mm.
counsel looks to me, Ellen Shansel Haskins. This was like such a great opportunity. I'll never forget her for doing this. She looked at me as a very young attorney, 2 years out, and she said, we need someone to be like the chief environmental compliance officer for this agency. Do you want to try? It's like,
I love it. Yes.
sure, sure. So
Sure.
this is like an example of state government work for attorneys. So
Mm.
you go to state government and you may not make as much, but you get opportunities like this as a young
Mm.
lawyer to like
Yeah.
do really like impactful work, as
Yep.
opposed to sometimes when you go to a law firm, you're doing the
Yeah.
doc review for years and you got to
Yep.
earn your stripes before you get the fun projects.
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I did that. I really enjoyed it. Like it was, I learned a lot. And I again got to work with engineers, and this is like
Mm.
a common theme in my work experience.
Mm.
And got to help the DOT make sure they were in compliance with environmental standards. Worked with,
Mm.
EPA, Illinois EPA, US EPA. So then after that, I applied to for a position at the Illinois Pollution Control Board,
Okay.
which is another state agency in Illinois that
Mm.
adjudicates environmental cases. So
Okay.
if there is a violation of the Illinois Environmental Protection Act
Right.
by an organization, the PCB, Pollution Control Board, would listen to the case and decide if they were in violation and potentially
Mm.
assess fines. So basically, I was reading these legal documents and these arguments that were made and deciding
Mm.
as one of 5 board members which way to
Mm.
go. Okay, so it was violations of air, land, and water. And I'm getting to kind of my next gig, which leads up to kind of everything I'm working on now. But
Yeah.
so at the Pollution Control Board, here again, we worked on like water issues,
Sure.
deciding the standards for the Chicago River, which if
Mm.
you've been to Chicago lately, we have this vibrant like um, resurgence at the lakefront in the river area. It's really beautiful. But the last case that I worked on was an air case, and
Mm.
it was determining the allowed emissions for a
Mhm.
coal generation fleet.
Okay.
And it was called the multi-pollutant standard. So, multi-pollutant standard is a case that you hear to allow to emit certain types of SOx and NOx, and how much and how many years they can do it for.
Mm.
And it was during this case that I heard a lot about the energy markets. So
Okay.
these generation fleets were
Mm.
making the case that they needed to stay online because they were in the MISO region, and there's these
Mhm.
markets that they had to
Mhm.
make sure they were becoming a must-run facility. They couldn't be turned off because they they are attributing to the reliability in the
Yep.
area. And
Sure.
so
Sure.
there was all this conversation about energy markets, must run, and electricity, and it became very clear how complex and kind of interesting these
Mhm.
issues are. Turns out when you turn on your light switch in your house, it's a lot more complex than I ever could have dreamed.
A lot of things have got to go right for that to happen.
100%
I
agree.
huge. It's a big deal. I agree. Yeah.
So I got really excited about energy, and I also realized
Mhm.
that I think if I wanted to make an impact in the environmental space, I
Mhm.
really wanted to flip to energy. All right.
Okay.
So JB Pritzker runs for governor, and one of his platforms, one of his like top three initiatives, is a clean energy initiative, and I got really
Okay.
excited about that. And so, to get appointed to these positions, you kind of throw your hat in the ring.
Mhm.
And he had a transition team, so people that when he first got elected, that he would listen to for suggestions of like agency heads. And I
Sure.
was a known commodity. I'd been in the state for at that point, 12 years, 14, 13 years.
Okay.
And one of the women on the transition team knew my work and knew my interest. And so she kind of, pushed my name up, interviewed for the job,
Mhm.
interviewed to be a commissioner, and they chose me to be the chair. Um, so in 2019, I became the chair of the Illinois Commerce Commission. Um,
Okay.
and if for folks that may not be familiar with this role,
Mhm.
it's our Public Utility Commission. Every state has them,
Right.
and we regulate the largest investor-owned utilities. So in Illinois, that means electric, gas, and water. So every all the spending that is done on behalf of these utilities, the regulator, the commissioners review every dollar spent and how
Mhm.
they can earn a return on it.
That's right.
So, I started in this role, and I think it was an opportunity of a lifetime, challenge of a lifetime.
Yeah.
Um, and
Wow.
if I'm gonna point to I think my favorite thing I got to work on while at the commission, it's kind of two things I want to talk about, and the
Sure.
second will kind of lead me to my second job, my
Yeah.
current job. So first.
Mhm.
As promised, Governor Pritzker delivered on his clean energy goals, and he helped pass the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. It's our state legislation that
Okay.
helps our grid, helps us decarbonize our grid and get to the goal of 1 million EVs on the road by I think it's 2030.
Okay.
And a lot of the work came to the commission. So
Mhm.
I had the honor of working through the first round of implementing CEJA through a
Okay.
variety of dockets at the commission. So that was
Okay.
really, really wonderful, and
Mhm.
really, again, something that I'm really proud of that I had a chance to be a part of. Um,
Yeah.
but an, but another like unexpected thing that happened while I was at the commission was the attention that I needed to devote to the markets.
Mhm.
So in Illinois, we're part of two markets, MISO and PJM. Um,
PJM.
and and I can talk a little bit more about, I don't know how deep you want me to go into explaining what the markets, how they operate, but we're part of these two markets. And what I've
Mhm.
found quickly in my role is that I was kind of asked a lot of the biggest questions by some of the highest profile people because of the market's issues. And let me explain
Mhm.
what I mean by that.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
So obviously we regulate how the utilities spend, and that's only a portion of your bill. The other portion, a lot of it comes from these markets and the cost to build transmission. I don't have
Mhm.
direct control over. I can advocate for in a variety. I have some levers that I can pull to advocate
Mhm.
at the two RTOs, but
Mhm.
we kept seeing a greater percentage of customers' bills were covered by these transmission markets costs. So there were times when markets shot up, particularly in the southern Illinois region,
Mhm.
and I'd get a call from the governor's office or I'd get a call from the state legislators. What are you doing? Like, what is happening
Right.
here and what are you
Right.
doing
Right.
about it? And
Yeah.
so I would have to be really engaged at these markets in a variety of places in a variety of ways. So
Mhm.
it turns out that even though I have control over the reliability of the small grid, the distribution grid,
Mhm.
none of that matters if the big grid, the market grid, the transmission lines that run
Transmission. Yep.
between states, if that goes down.
Absolutely.
And we're
Yep.
moving to this like watershed moment where while
Mhm.
reliability is really good in under the utilities that I used to regulate, very good, like they've won
Mhm.
awards.
Mhm.
The reliability on the wholesale side is really starting to worry me.
Mhm.
So that's kind of where I got really interested and involved, and I saw the big picture of how a lot of the fight is at the wholesale side, the transmission side, the market
Mm-hmm.
side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there was this opportunity. It's a new position at American Clean Power Association
Mm-hmm.
for the markets VP of Markets and Transmission.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I applied last summer, and I have been there for 7 months. Um, and let me just say a little, like, for those of you who may not be familiar with American Clean Power, American Clean
Yeah,
Power
please.
Association is actually, it's a newer association. It's only been around for a couple years. It
Okay.
has its roots in the Wind Association and the Storage Association. They kind of merged together, but
Okay.
we have 800 members of a variety of technologies, with a quickly growing staff. So last year around this time we were at 50, and now we're at over 100. So
Wow. Wow.
we're a well-funded association, and our goal is to increase amount of clean energy in that on the grid, and we do that in a variety of ways.
Okay. Okay.
Very
Are
very
you
long answer.
No, no, no. It's great. I mean, we covered a lot of good stuff. The technology, it can be anybody's technology anywhere in the US. It doesn't have to be, in your geographical region, so to speak. I mean, are you guys willing to look at anything? Are you more macro in that
Yes,
sense?
we're everywhere. It's anywhere in the United States, and
Okay.
we have a lot of the big organizations like the Invenergies and the RWEs. So a lot of
Yeah.
the stuff that's building these huge projects,
Yeah.
Ørsted, which is doing a lot of offshore wind.
Right.
So we do
Yep.
wind, solar storage, hydrogen, some
Hydrogen.
of
Yeah.
the new technologies that are using those types of resources to interconnect them
Mhm.
into the grid in really innovative ways. And so all types of members.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. No, that's good to know. I want to just jump back just for a minute. I mean, great answer, a lot of depth. I think we could go 1,000 different directions, which is good. But I mean, I think you said two things that were you said a lot of things, but two things that kind of jumped out I thought were really interesting, and maybe just an encouragement too to the people listening. I mean, you went into the engineering, and it's admirable. You muscled through it. You got it done. And I think a lot of people today, you hear a lot about, lean into your passion, and you got to really like what you do. Sometimes, and I'm sure in your role too, sometimes you just got to get stuff done. And it may not be the most enjoyable, may not be what I thought it was going to be, but you got to see it through. And that is part of life too. And I think sometimes that message gets missed. And when people look at you and see you successful as a vice president, like, I want to get where you are. And they can oftentimes think, well, it was a pretty easy path for her. I mean, everything kind of lined up. She just followed her passions and it all worked out. And it's like, go back and listen to what you just said. And that's not the case. So I think that's such an admirable quality. And I appreciate, the tenacity to get to kind of where you are. And also, I think so many times in life, when you push through, the opportunity that you're in, it sets you up for another opportunity. I mean, when you're doing the DOT stuff as an attorney, but you're an engineer. So I mean, I could see it now, right? You get good buy-in from your engineering team. They're taking you, seriously in the kind of the technical sense, and probably more apt to listen to what you have to say. So you as a leader in guiding and directing, it just takes on a whole different persona, and your credibility is very different. And your appreciation for what they do is different because you understand what they do, not just by proxy, but you've been around the work. And then you take all of that and it kind of rolls up. Now we're talking about the energy markets. So, looking at the technical background, your legal background, and how they've really blended together, to here you are, later in your career, right? To some point, kind of seeing everything come together. It's a beautiful story because I think a lot of people think that that's supposed to happen in 3 or 4 years, and it's kind of should be easy. And it's like, I've yet to interview anybody on this podcast where it was easy to get to where they got and everything lined up. And a lot of times their paths took different directions, that have brought them to where they are. That's super exciting, but it's always this meandering path, right? So I appreciate the background. I mean, and then your time as the chair, that's really fascinating. I mean, that gives you such good visibility. I mean, it's a great position to be in. It's a tough position, but I mean, you get to hear a lot. And here you are, at American Clean Power. I mean, it's just cool. I mean, it's just, I could just see how it's just built to put you where you are today, right? And the things you can do today are results of lots of different things that you have, constituent parts that make you where you're on point today. That's great. No, I appreciate it. It's great. I mean, and I think it's an important point that it needs to be emphasized again and again. But tell us a little bit about what's the projects you're working on today, I mean, and I also know you're doing some adjunct teaching at the university in the law side. So also kind of what are you doing today kind of in your role, but also in the teaching, what courses are you teaching, or how are you tying in or bringing your experience now to the law school, and probably opening up lots of minds, I would imagine, to, hey, y'all, there's all kinds of cool stuff that you can do one day. Look at what I'm doing right now. So I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So as the vice president of markets and transmission, I'm the first one to have this role at ACP. So I'm
Okay.
kind of starting from scratch. But
Mhm.
my basic charge is to remove barriers
Mhm.
of entry in clean energy to the wholesale markets.
Oh,
And
okay.
so I talked to you a bit about like PJM and MISO.
Mhm.
Um, there's a lot of, we believe there's a lot of barriers that still exist for entry. A really, really good example. So if I'm listing like
Yeah.
my top 2 or 3 things, if I could, if I had a wish list or things that
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
working on basically daily, is interconnection is one.
Mm.
So right now, interconnection in some markets take 5 years. So
Yep.
if you can imagine, if you were
Yes.
a large generator, if you're a developer and
Yep.
you go through the process of deciding you want to build something, you figure out where you want to build it, and you get all the financing lined up,
Yep.
and you're ready to go, and you put your application in the queue at a market like PJM,
Yep.
and then you just sit. And you don't know
Yeah.
if it's going to be 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. You hope it's shorter, but it could be
Yep.
longer. Right
Yep.
now, average is 5. And if you like sit and reflect upon that, if you think back about what the world looked like 5 years ago,
Yeah.
pre-COVID, pre-inflation, supply chain looked very different, workforce
Yep.
looked very different. So you're asking these businesses to make these decisions, and with very little certainty. And so this is really obviously the time is a problem because we need these resources online now, because we
Yep.
actually have a resource adequacy issue, meaning we don't have enough resources online to meet
Yep.
demand. Probably now and in the very near future, it's about to get a lot worse.
Yep.
So interconnection is something we spend a lot of time thinking about. There's been some movement through we're always monitoring in my world the FERC, the Federal
Yep.
Energy Regulatory Commission. So
Yep.
FERC
Yep.
issued an order, and so we were happy
Mhm.
about that, but we think there's more work to be done. And then the second thing I always have to talk about is transmission.
Yes,
We desperately need more transmission.
we do.
Um,
Yep.
and there's a map Rob Graham like put together, who's kind of a guru in this space. He put together a map grading different RTOs, and some RTOs are getting Ds, like for lack of planning and building transmission.
Hmm.
And so when you say, what are you working on? I mean, these things all take time, like building transmission, um, for one, takes a very long time just because of the
Yep.
nature of it. There's a process, but even like
Mhm.
getting to the planning stage, we're just trying to get RTOs to plan properly. So I spent a lot of
Okay.
my time working on those two things, because I would assume if you ask anyone in the clean energy space, especially on the wholesale side, they'd
Yep.
say those two things are the biggest troubles.
It's what's interesting. Yeah, it's good to hear. I mean that that you're latching on to that and doing something about it. I mean, I've seen that a lot in my career as well. Before founding, the recruiting company that we have today, which specializes in renewable energy, clean tech, that kind of thing. I was at a smaller engineering firm, and we worked on power projects primarily on the West Coast. But one of my clients, MRP, right there in Chicago, who I support, I mean, you run into that issue all the time as you're developing projects, particularly in California. You got to deal with CAISO. It's
Mhm.
it's challenging, and I don't think most people. I'm glad you called it out. Really get it. If that light switch you talked about earlier doesn't go on, you're gonna wait 4 to 5 years, then it'll turn on. And you're right. But the problem is, over that 4 to 5 years, the demand is increasing,
Yep.
right? And so you got a problem today, but you're gonna have a huge problem in 5 years from now. So, and and it's a huge, it's a lot of risk reward. I think the developers sometimes can get a bad rap for, when they made a lot of money on the project. But, I've been around development a long time, and I can tell you, you got to look at 100 to find the one that might work. And then to your point, maybe you get the interconnection, maybe you don't. Maybe you need to get 50, 100, 200 megawatts on the line, but you can't get it all because we don't have the bandwidth, or you have to upgrade the substation. Now all of a sudden the deal doesn't pencil because I don't have another 4 million to throw into transformers.
Right.
And so what? So what? The last couple of years of all risk for nothing. So to your point, that's just reassuring to hear. Huge problem from what I've seen. What the transmission side? I mean, how do we tackle that particular issue? I mean, it's hard enough to get a transmission line, let's call it in state, but the minute you cross state lines, it's like a nightmare. So I'd love to get your take on that. How do we resolve this particular issue?
Well, the onus truly is on you're not, if you have a map of the country, not every inch of the country is covered by a market. These
Right.
7 ISOs, RTOs, these
Mhm.
regional transmission organizations, but the ones that are, the onus is on the RTO. That is truly one of their missions, like
Okay.
one of their 2 goals, to run an effective market and to do transmission planning. That is their goal, right? So let's start there. They
Okay.
need to do, they need to make sure that they are doing that correctly.
Okay.
And there's some markets that are doing well, doing better than others, like MISO, for example. And if you're thinking of a map of the United States, MISO is like the Midwest, like up from the North
Mhm.
Dakotas. It moves all the way kind of through like the plains, and it
Yep.
actually extends down to Louisiana. So it actually
Mhm.
it's by geography the biggest market. And so if you think about like the Dakotas, have a lot of wind, and they're trying to move it to the population centers.
That's right.
They're trying to
Yeah.
get it to Chicago, and so
Yeah.
transmission is what helps.
Yeah.
And so MISO's kind of taken this, they've tackled this problem kind of head on. They have something called the LRTP.
Mhm.
And the idea is that they're building out transmission in the footprint, kind of
Mhm.
trying to do it in an expeditious way. But other RTOs aren't necessarily doing that. And so I spend a lot of time advocating for that within the RTO, but also advocating for it at FERC, because the
Okay.
RTOs are regulated by the FERC.
Mhm. Mhm.
So we are hearing we hope there's good news coming. We're hoping and anticipating a rule that to be finalized from the FERC in April that's going to
Mhm.
address the requirements for these RTOs to do better transmission planning in a
Okay.
variety of ways. So it would now require the RTOs to do it. Um, but I think to make things more complicated is when you
Mhm.
look at the interregional transfers,
There you
right?
go.
So like, it's hard enough for MISO to do it, hard enough for PJM to do it, but what if you want to have coordination between MISO and PJM?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's more difficult. Now, there is some efforts through joint projects between like SPP, which is another market, and MISO. There is some coordination, but again, it's hard enough. It's like governance, right? You have 2 different
Yeah.
like countries talking to each other. So
Yeah. Oh yeah.
we believe at ACP that probably the best place to get that done is on the Hill.
Yeah.
So we have a federal policy team that is frankly there every day talking to a variety of elected officials about what
Mhm.
needs to be
Mhm.
done. And there's been some bills floated. There was something called the Big Wires Act that was floated by Senator Hickenlooper in the fall. We're
Uh,
not sure that it's going to have traction, but it
uh,
speaks to that interregional transfer capability. Like
okay.
he was recommending like a 30%. Um, and if I can talk a little bit about why interregional transfer capability is probably the most important and perhaps low-hanging fruit kind of for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Please. Yeah.
you know, I I've witnessed, I was sitting as a chair on the commission as I watched the storm hit Uri, and we
Mhm.
witnessed in Texas. So that's that storm that hit in
Mhm.
2021 in Texas, where
Uh,
dozens of people died. I mean, when a storm hits and power goes down, it's one thing if you can't charge your cell phone. It's another thing if like you need life-saving, devices and they're not
Absolutely.
powered, or people are freezing in their homes, which did happen. People died in their homes.
Yeah. 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 It's
Catastrophic
tragic.
things.
No, absolutely.
And interregional transfer capability. So the Texas grid was not prepared, and they've done a lot of work to make it more prepared, like weatherization, for example.
Mhm.
But the interregional, so the ability for MISO, which abuts next to ERCOT,
Right.
to send down power when it
Mhm.
really needs it is like insurance.
Yeah.
So if you have the ability to transfer this power, it can literally save lives. And so it's really like insurance. Like, is it expensive? Will you be using it every day? No, but it's there when you really, really need it.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like in some ways too, like in California, it's like, when you throw the peakers on when you really, really need them, you're going to pay for it and it's expensive. But if you need it to curtail the blackout or, get through the brownouts, you do what you got to do for that 2 or 3% of the year to make it happen. So to your point, to me, it's just prudence.
Mhm.
And I mean, I like your approach. I think that when you do the interregional stuff, you got to have an arbitrator, and quite frankly, they have to kind of have a bigger stick, right?
Mhm.
And so I think going on the Hill and looking at something more from a federal standpoint to ensure that there is general cooperation that could be life saving is something that makes sense. I think at the bare minimum. What's your take on HVDC? I mean, I thought about that. I worked on the Transbay Cable project. Doing the was it 60 nautical miles or so, 55 nautical miles under San Francisco Bay, and went from the city of Pittsburgh into an old PG&E substation in Potrero. So I was a part of that. And I mean, that made a massive difference to the city of San Francisco. They had huge demand concerns, and this was one way to solve that particular problem. But when you look at long distance transmission type moving of power, I'm just curious what your thought is. You see some HVDC projects, around the world. Do you think it's got a play, or it should have more of a play? Or I'm just kind of curious.
I think it should absolutely have more of a play. It's a great
Okay.
technology, and some of the
Okay.
projects I've seen are truly innovative, like connecting to RTOs or
Hmm.
population resources. Some
Yeah.
are underground, some are like, on rail right away.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
so we absolutely think that HVDC is very important, and
Okay.
we
Okay.
strongly advocate for it. Um, One thing that's truly frustrating, I think, to some of our members that own these types of lines is the way they're treated in the queue. Like in PJM, for example, they're treated as a generation source. So they're sitting in these 5-year queues. And
Mm-hmm.
their point is like, we can help solve a big problem if you
Yep.
help us move quickly. We can add this type of reliability that
Yep.
maybe other resources cannot add. So I absolutely think that they are necessary and a really strong part of the future of our grid.
Okay.
And I think like
Interesting.
just in general, like we're learning. So it's like it's a big science project on the grid. It's so interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
the grid operators, these RTOs, are trying to plan and anticipate and model weather events, but the weather events keep changing, right? And so like
Yeah.
every time, and also we're
Yeah.
moving from something called a summer peak to a winter peak, meaning
Right.
like the events that we should really be scared about for the grid, for the reliability of the grid, is winter. And so every time there's a winter event, we
Mm-hmm.
kind of all brace and see how everything goes. And
Okay.
what we're learning is, the old adage, and this isn't an anti-fossil fuel slant. This really is a reliability issue. We're seeing
Mm-hmm.
that gas is struggling because for a variety of reasons, whether it's lack of weatherization, but even like the coordination, the ability to buy the commodity through a
Mm-hmm.
different market that's closed on 3-day holidays, when sometimes, okay, always these storms hit,
Right. Right. Right.
wreaks havoc on the system. And there's a lot of gas on the system. And I'm not suggesting that it all should be shut down tomorrow. That is not what I'm suggesting. But
Sure.
when looking at it from a reliability perspective,
Uh,
gas is really what's causing a lot of the issues. In fact, NERC has said,
mm.
which is another regulatory body, has
Yep.
said that it is the single source of failure for winter peaking events. So I
Mm.
think the answer is diversity. So,
Yep.
it has to be solar, but also wind, but also storage, but also high voltage DC lines, like all the things, because,
Right.
these storms act different ways and they move in different directions. And sometimes like I was doing a recap of Heather, and we saw a lot of wind in MISO. And so during that storm,
Mhm,
wind was like the hero in some of the parts of MISO. And
mhm.
so I really believe that it's the diversity of not just one type of
Right.
resource, but all the types that are really going to get us to the more reliable grid, especially with this
Yeah.
massive load increase coming at us.
No, I appreciate your take on that. I would agree. I've always been kind of a diversity guy. As I you just can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It just doesn't make sense. And so you get into those conversations and you're like, wow, I mean, yeah, spread the risk a little bit. I think everything's got to play to some extent and leverage it, because I think you've done a good job of articulating. We have some really serious problems we have to solve, and we need the generation that we have that can be made available when we need it to solve these big problems, which I almost feel like in some ways too, the only way I can describe this, and you can jump off of this point, but I feel like when you're running a race, I like to run, but I'm not a very fast runner. I'm pretty slow. So if I start off at the same time as somebody else who's a minute faster per mile, you know what I mean? I'm going to have to really ramp it up to try to catch them after the first couple of miles, because they're always kind of gaining on me. And I feel like that's part of the problem that we're trying to solve, is that this, the needs for the demand of power over the next 5 to 10 years that are increasing at a significant rate. We can ramp up the capability for transmission and distribution, but at some point you have to kind of supercharge one to catch the demand. And I think that's just really, really, it's always hard to kind of come from behind in that sense. Yeah, and I, I, I think you've done a good job of articulating that. I mean, it's a real problem that we have, and it's complex on many levels. I mean, just the governance side, the technology side. Is there a cooperation? I mean, all the way down to investment dollars. Who's going to put money in if they're going to have to wait 5 years? That's a tricky one. I mean, it can be a big risk. And anyway, it's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. And the
The,
demand seems to be always going up, right? I mean, we're not slowing down. We're not going backwards.
Yeah, and that's a new
Yeah.
phenomenon. We've been flat for a couple decades, but we're seeing just demand in general, things like EVs and electrification of buildings. But the biggest one is the data centers and some of these like
Mhm.
hyper scale data centers that
Wow. Okay.
require a lot
Mm,
of new generation. And
mm,
to your point, Joe, I think, there's a conversation amongst like my peers about how we should treat this like the highway system. Like if you think
mm,
about when the highway system was built in the US,
mm.
and how we kind of all bought into it because we knew it would all help us. It would help
Yep.
us grow our economy, it would help us get around the
Yep.
country. It would benefit us in ways that we couldn't even imagine. I would
Hmm.
argue transmission is even offers more benefits. Like we're trying to build this like renaissance of manufacturing in the United States because of the IRA, and there's
Hmm.
a lot of interest in it, and people are really trying to
Hmm.
open up these manufacturing plants for batteries, for example, and solar
Hmm.
panels. But we
Yep.
need the power to get to these manufacturing plants. And
Right.
that is the thing that helps us all, right? It creates good paying jobs. It
Right.
brings money to our tax base. So even aside from the life-saving power that it provides for essential services,
Yeah.
and national security, by the way, it's also the economics of it. Like we should all be very excited and willing to get on board to have like a national grid that kind of is a backbone infrastructure of our country.
Yeah. I mean, I've never heard it explained that way, but I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me. I've got a friend who lives in Africa, and it's interesting when you talk to him about how long it takes to get from like one city to the other. It's not very far away, but it takes like all day because
Mhm.
the roads are terrible. They get washed out. You can't go very fast. I mean, it's a train wreck. We're here, right? 3 hours later, you can be 200 miles down the road, no problem. So I agree. It's a what would you say, a kind of a short term ish burden for a huge long term win.
Mhm.
So I kind of like that analogy. I appreciate you sharing that. What's your take on kind of on the small nuclear reactors? I mean, you're hearing more buzz about this. I know Gates got money in it. Do y'all see that as a clean form of power? More distributive power? does that have a play in a mix in what you would like to see or does make sense for the country? I mean, you're the first person I've asked kind of about that. I'm curious to get your take.
Yeah, for this answer, I'll probably put on more of my like old hat as a commissioner.
Uh-huh.
I think nuclear is a great resource. It's
Okay.
done really well for Illinois. We have 54% generation of nuclear in our state, so it's
Oh, I
really
had no
helped us
idea. Really? That much?
double
54% of your power? Really?
we're double of any other state. Yeah, we have a
Wow.
lot of nuclear.
Okay, I didn't know that.
And it's
Okay.
great base load, right? Like it
It
once you
is.
ramp it up, it's there.
Yep.
The small not modular is I find it really exciting and I
Uh-huh.
think it can be a really great resource. The problem is cost, right? Like that's the issue with
It's
a lot of these
expensive.
technologies, right? It
Mhm.
needs to make sense economically.
Mhm.
It's interesting because I was talking to the dean of engineering at U of I
Mhm.
about how they used to have like a small a nuclear reactor at the campus, and then
Really?
everyone got nervous, right? Like there was that like shift of mind
Yeah.
frame, and now we're
Yeah.
all back to the beginning where we now know that it is absolutely it's safe and we know how to handle it. So they're
Right.
actually building a nuclear reactor and they're going to bury it in the under the quad. I mean, that just tells you how safe it is. But
Wow.
I think the technology is
Wow.
fascinating. I'm really
Okay.
excited and supportive, but it's the economics. Like it has to work economically for it to make sense. Um, but I think it could be cool, but that's about all I know about it. Like I haven't put a lot of time and attention to
Sure.
like how the
Sure.
economics are going and how the innovation's going. But it excites me
Yeah.
if we can figure
Yeah.
it out.
Yeah, I probably share the same take you do. I think it's exciting. I think it's a unique opportunity. The economics have been a challenge. I've certainly read that, and hopefully, like anything else, I'm hoping over time, lessons learned. You could kind of shave the price down to get it to a place that makes sense. I mean, solar projects were really expensive in the beginning, and now they're obviously at scale and not quite the same price per watt that they were 25 years ago. So I don't know. Hopefully we'll see some improvements there. But I think it's interesting. One of the things that I kind of switching gears a little bit.
Mhm.
I think it's always fun to know. Question I like to ask is, what's it like, a day in your life? What's it? How does Carrie make it happen? From sun up to sundown. Yeah, I'm kind of curious. And also I do want to know too. Kind of the other caveat I want to throw in there. What part of your day is sort of non-negotiable in terms of something that you do or need or want, or it's the cup of coffee or whatever it is. I'm kind of curious how the day plays out, but what part of your day is a real staple and you lean on it and it's made a difference for you?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'm sure everyone always says I have no typical day. I do something different every day, but I'm always trying to keep my eye on the prize. Like it's kind of like moving a tank sometimes, moving things slowly to make impact.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a couple of things that kind of drive and I can be pulled off of my day if something major happens. So if
Sure.
there's a major order issued by FERC and we have to file like a response to it, or if there's something major that happens at a certain RTO and it's brought to our attention and we have to quickly react, maybe get a coalition of our members together and
Mm-hmm.
try to get consensus about filing something. For example,
Sure.
there was like something that happened in MISO, like they wanted to cap the interconnection queue, and that was something we had a real problem with. So we had to kind of
Sure.
pivot and figure out how we would respond.
Mm-hmm.
And equally so, kind of for comm stuff. So sometimes a story will either be asked by a reporter about something like a winter storm event and how renewables did, or we'll
Mm-hmm.
see like kind of a story that we don't think is factually correct, and we'll react
Right.
to that. Um,
Okay.
Yes, I'm sure you're familiar.
Yeah,
But a
yeah,
lot of it
absolutely.
too is we run a monthly committee meeting. So
Okay.
we set the agenda, and this is all of the highly technical, like markets and transmission gurus from each of these huge members. So very sophisticated, knowledgeable people. We
Mm-hmm.
bring them together for this like it's only an hour once a month, and I need to set the agenda of what I think I need to talk to them. It could be a filing before FERC or MISO. It could be me reporting out on what's happening in one of these
Mm-hmm.
places.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a question I want to pose to the group. What do y'all think about this? What should we do in
Sure.
reaction? So a lot of it is dependent on that. Um, I also have a bit of traveling in my job for a variety of reasons, like whether it's
Okay.
speaking on these issues at a conference. ACP
Hmm.
has about 5 or 6 conferences a year, and I'll make sure that I'm traveling and speaking on these topics
You
and
were just in
giving
Texas too. Yeah.
just in Texas.
Yep.
That's right. And making sure that our members get a chance to explain their side, how
Mhm.
how they see some of the issues coming at them.
Okay.
This last week, I was at our board meeting, our American Clean Power Executive Board meeting in Utah, and so I presented to the board my vision for 2024 and
Okay.
received their questions. So there's quite a bit of travel involved. And I'm also building out my team. So I have an Eastern director. I'm hiring a Western director. I'm trying to hire like a coordinator, and then someone eventually in ERCOT. So that's a PSA if anyone's interested in those
Mm.
issues. So interviewing, and so it's a lot going on at once. Um, but your question about what's a non-negotiable
Yeah.
is working out every morning.
All right.
So
What kind of work?
I
What kind of workouts do you do? Yeah.
Well, right now I do a ton of Orange Theory. I like
Oh yeah,
mixing.
yeah.
I'm trying to do more weights, but cardio is what kind of wakes me up and gets me, the juices flowing.
Yep.
So I try to do something every morning. And even when it's really hard, I try to go for a walk because
Sure.
um, for me that's better than coffee. It
Okay.
gets things moving. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know if I answered your question, but I did want to talk a little bit about that law class.
Yeah. No. Let's. Yeah. We can jump. Let's pivot back to that. I'm curious what you're doing. Yeah. What
Okay.
you're teaching. Yeah.
All right. So I'm teaching this last fall. I taught with 2 other co-adjuncts. It's a class called Clean Energy Law. And let me
Oh
just tell
wow.
you a little bit about
Yeah.
how I ended up there and why I wanted to teach. Okay,
Yeah.
so I told you how I didn't have like lawyers in my family, and I kind of like flitted around to these other areas and found the place that I love eventually, energy
Yeah.
law,
Yeah.
particularly clean energy.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I absolutely wanted to pay forward.
Mm,
You can
okay.
ask my students, like I start almost every class like I'm going to end this class hoping that you are so excited to go into only this area because it's so cool. Let me tell you all the cool things that you could be doing.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so that's one piece of it. Another thing is when we would post to hire attorneys at the commission, we would get some applicants, but never enough. So I would always try to go to the law schools. And by the way, I'd go into engineering classes too. And I'd say, this may not be on your radar, but you should work at a commission. Like it is doing some of the coolest, most impactful stuff in for
Mm,
climate change or energy that you can imagine. So
right. Right.
come
Right.
to a commission. You're not going to make maybe as much money as you like, but come for a short while, make an
Yeah.
impact, learn everything, and then go to the next thing. Um,
Sure.
so
Sure.
I did that. I was invited to speak, and I actually just went this week and spoke with the same class at a climate. It's called like a climate colloquium. So they take just a bunch
Mm,
of different topics on climate change, and I was
mm,
invited to speak about clean energy.
mm,
And I was talking to the professor, Michael Barza, about what Northwestern Law School, a really good law school, offers
mm.
for energy, either utility or clean energy, and it
Sure.
turns out it's nothing.
Nada.
So
Yeah.
so I
Wow.
kind of like pitched the dean of Northwestern. I said, "Look, you should be teaching this. This is like super important. There's lots of
Yeah.
jobs. I'm seeing jobs everywhere." And she kind of said, "Well, yeah, maybe you should teach it." And so that's kind of
Right. Right.
how it came to be. And I teach it with um so we wanted to give like the full picture of what it means to be a clean energy attorney, and that could mean a lot of different things. So I
Mm,
have a another co-adjunct, um Christine um, Owen Erickson, who is a partner at Norton Rose, and she does the real estate aspects of clean energy.
okay.
And then Tanya Rebchek, who I used to work with at the commission, she works in climate tech. And so we
Okay.
wanted to like give pieces of the story, and hopefully students will say,
Mm.
well, I want to do that part of clean energy.
Oh, it's great. I mean, you're providing kind of a nice, clean overview, which is wow. That's. I mean, you kind of hope that the students appreciate, at the end of the day, because I mean, having the opportunity to sort of get that breadth of what you can do with law in the world of clean energy, what a fascinating opportunity, really. So, do you kind of trade off? Are you teaching every couple of classes, or do you basically do it in chunks where it's lockstep? The first 4 or 5 classes will be, let's say, on the real estate side. Then you can look at kind of the stuff that you're doing, and then how does it get structured?
We try to tell a story, kind of like from beginning to end, and then whoever
Hmm.
has the expertise in that part of the story, we speak on it. So I spent
Okay.
a ton of time talking about FERC and the markets and
Hmm.
how you engage there. Christine talked a little bit, a lot about like land use and how negotiating contracts and siting and permitting.
Yep. It's a big
Tanya
part.
talked about like the different technologies and the need for climate tech. She did talk about some of the distributed energy issues.
Uh-huh.
And I want to correct myself. I misstated her name. It's Christine Fernandez Owen is the adjunct professor that's at Norton Rose. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, we split it up and we kind of
Okay.
just and so sometimes I'm talking 3 classes in a row and then I'm
Sure.
not. So it just depends.
This is good. So what's the response like? And how many students are in the room? I'm just curious. Like, I know, like, I'm in Arkansas, so, and I've got buddies that went to University of Arkansas Law School, so I've heard now. But what's your audience like, and what are they? What kind of vibe are you getting from them? Are you getting some that are like, oh wow, this is amazing, and I mean, some probably going to want to go off and do other things, and that's fine. But what's the yeah, kind of how does that play out?
Okay, so we were warned, this is the first time we offered it in the fall, and we were warned that we'd probably only get a handful, like 5. And the professor and the administrative dean said, like we'll probably go down to like 5 and we can keep the class, but if you get below it, you may not be teaching this fall. I just want to warn you, it takes
Yeah.
some ramp up. Well, and so I should also add it's a 2-hour class and I think it's capped at like 25. So we were
Okay.
kind of watching the registration and it kind of drops all at once and we were
Yeah.
oversubscribed.
You serious?
30 wait list.
No
So
way.
so to
Oh my
me that's like
gosh.
there's an interest and a need, right? That's very telling.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
so shifting into the class, like so we're talking
Wow.
about Northwestern Law School, one of the best
Yeah.
law schools in the country. Um, in the class are some of the brightest students I've ever interacted with. So I raised the question at the beginning. I'm like, who's worked in energy?
Yeah.
Some guy was an engineer and for a developer for like 5-10 years. Some
Wow.
person worked at the FERC as an intern. You had,
Really?
and some had never dealt with energy. It wasn't a
Yeah.
prereq, but it was funny because sometimes I would, someone would ask me a question or I'd say something and then I would turn it to the class. I'm like, does anyone have anything to add? Always feel free to correct me or interject. And some of them would be like, oh, the capacity factor for that type of module is actually blah, 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 because he knew it. So
It's
like it was
great.
really great, different reception. So there are
Sure.
some students that already had positions locked in because it's Northwestern Law School. So they're kind of
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
places, really great places.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but so it was really good reception. I love teaching. I really enjoy it.
Wow. Have you set it up where you're going to get to come back and do it again and again? And was this like a trial run and then we'll keep you on the docket if it makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's right. You kind of you submit that you want to teach again, and then I think because of the interest in it, I
Yeah.
think it'll go again next fall. But we can only do, we were asked if we want to teach in the spring too, and we're like, it's a lot. It's a very heavy lift, and you do it because you want to,
Right.
but
Right.
we have to be
Yeah.
mindful of everything else we have going on.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I've never taught at the law school, but I could see where, I mean, if you could do it once a year, I think that's a lot, really. I think there's probably a ton of prep. There's coordination, obviously the drive in, drive out. I mean, and you got a day job, so it's not insignificant. But if you could do it one semester a year, I mean, and quite frankly, that response rate's pretty impressive. I'd almost feel like it's incumbent upon the law school to say, I mean, even if they didn't like you, like, yeah, you probably should come back. I mean, there's a you kind of hit a hot button here, and who knows where it goes. I mean, you guys doing this after a couple of years might change some of the landscape of who applies to the law school because that's an area they really, really want to specialize in. I mean, that's how some of those real niche specialties get created, right? they start somewhere, then they blossom out, and then all of a sudden you're like, wow, this is a very sort of niche crown jewel of our program, and we're very proud of it, and it is very unique, and quite frankly, it's difficult to get into. I mean, that could end up happening, right? 5, 10 years from now. Wow, that's great. Okay, cool. One of the things I do want to ask before we wind down for today is I'm always curious. What's some of the best advice you've ever received? I mean, we've talked a lot about your journey, what you're doing now, problems you're facing, and I'm always curious. Best advice, because oftentimes it can be like a real guiding principle to how someone operates and makes decisions. And I think the proof's in the pudding. But I'm curious. Personal, professional, either one doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think it's kind of something that you recognize, and I it's kind of something I've lived by is, take the situation and learn as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I told you I was in jobs I didn't like, and even in those jobs, stay
Mm-hmm.
curious at all times and learn as much as
Mm-hmm.
possible. But also, the network piece is super important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Making sure I've done a pretty good job, even in places where I was not very happy, finding someone. Now I'm kind of on the mentor side of things,
Mm-hmm.
but I always was kind of a mentee and made sure that when I really was either spinning my wheels or making
Mm-hmm.
not sure if I was understanding what my role was, finding someone that would open up and kind of guide you. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so building that mentor mentee relationship, which is sometimes people aren't interested in mentoring, and that's fine. Don't take it
Mm-hmm.
personally. As
Sure.
someone who's very busy, I understand like the time constraints as a mentor, but
Mm-hmm.
making sure that's an important part, I think, of your progression through your career. And then
Mm-hmm.
like maintaining relationships, so making plenty of new relationships, but like having authentic relationships
Mm-hmm.
with people that you had worked with, who you currently
Mm-hmm.
work with, because you kind of never know like where it leads or
Yeah.
what needs will be in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. I do get that feedback a fair bit. This idea of mentorship, being very important, and it has been a very I see it as a consistent thread through a lot of people's lives who have become very successful and in positions of power. And oftentimes they'll admit, I didn't get here on my own. It was the advice of the time so and so spent with me, et cetera, that has allowed. I like your point on being curious. I no one's ever framed it that way, but I like that because yeah, sometimes you just got to power through it, but there's always a nugget or two. I mean, I can look at some of the worst jobs I had, prior to getting a professional job, and I'd be lying if I said there wasn't something, at least one or two things in those jobs that actually has helped me move forward. As awful as some of them were, there was silver lining. And I think we can choose to see it and accept it, or we can choose to disregard it. And then you kind of lose the whole thing, really. And the authentic relationship piece is, yeah, it's fantastic. Because you never know where you're going to end up. And quite frankly, how many times have I talked to people about this clients? It's a small pond in a way, right? It's clean energy, the energy mix. I mean, you see it as this behemoth, but in some ways, not so much. People tend to stay in the same circles if they're pretty good and pretty successful, and you never know who you're going to cross paths with. And it's always nice to see somebody too, right? That you worked a project with that was very successful, and you had some good wins, and you spent some time, in a few foxholes together and sweating it, with some of these decisions that get made, and like, oh man, I hope we get through the queue, and the timing happens right, and we get the permit, the licensing lines up. It's like, anyway, yeah, kind of the what would you say? You've been battle tested, and you have that depth. I think that adds to the authenticity of the relationship, which is really nice. Maybe the last questions I've got for you is, if we're looking out kind of the next 5, 10 years, what would you like to see happen? Where would you like to see the mix? I know we've talked about transmission, being a big issue, but and it's a bit of this is a predictability thing, right? I mean, we're taking a guess, we don't really know. But in 5 to 10 years, what would you be pretty happy with seeing have been accomplished in this space?
Yeah, I think, you know, I, I think the biggest thing again is getting these resources online ASAP. And I think that our hand might be forced. I'm really concerned about the tsunami that's coming at us. So load increase, retirements
Mhm.
of coal for a variety of reasons, the fleet's going to be halved, I think by
Mhm.
2030 of what it is now. So that's going away. Loads increasing,
Yep.
extreme weather events. There's an interest and demand to be, or an interest in being interconnected, but there's just all these barriers. So
Sure.
I worry, I don't hope for this. I worry that something catastrophic is going to happen.
Okay.
And that
Okay.
might be the like threshold moment where we kind of,
Mhm.
that if it's, if it's the Hill or government that really understands the danger. Um, I read somewhere that cyber threats on the grid are up like 77% this year. Like
Wow. I
that
didn't
could
know that.
that could come at us. So
Absolutely.
I worry something really bad happens. I hope it doesn't. I hope we
Mhm.
fix it before then. But then I see like some major change. Whether it is like we talked about, a backbone transmission line across the
Mhm.
country or like major changes in the market. But
Mhm.
nobody wants to be in a position of power when you have people dying in your state.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
you
it's a tough
know,
one. Yeah.
so I do think real change is going to come. I'm certainly going to fight every day to make sure it
Sure.
happens like in all the right regulatory ways. And
Yeah.
I'm energized to do that. But I do think big change comes, but I worry it's because of something bad. That's
As a piggyback to that, where would we get more momentum, or as far as that shift is concerned, is it more of being on the Hill and getting a greater consensus amongst the federal lawmakers that to the point I think you articulated very well, like you got to get this through your head and you really got to own it? Or do you think we get more momentum where just the country at large, right? Just anybody walking down the street within reason has a better understanding and appreciation of the reality, which quite frankly, we're all living in. I mean, you don't get to escape this. It's going to impact you. So you maybe, with what you do for a living, it can't directly impact it like you can, but you have to be mindful of this and some of the decisions, sacrifices, and consequences of either dealing with it or not dealing with it. Do you think it's more of a general mass issue that would help really move the needle and kind of rocket fuel us, or is it the Hill? If I'm just kind of curious, which one might carry more weight at the end of the day to really help solve it?
I think both because I think if you get to the public, then
Yeah.
especially the public that votes and is vocal, then you
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
to the Hill. Um, I spend a
Okay.
lot of time thinking about ways to push out this message to the public,
Okay.
whether it's even like educating legislators in congressmen and or like the public.
Sure.
What's concerning and a little frustrating is that sometimes this issue can be partisan. I'm not suggesting that
Yeah.
there aren't folks on the Republican side that aren't, supporting renewables or supporting transmission, but right now we have a Republican House, a Democratic Senate, and then a Democratic president, and it's kind of a coin toss what's coming next.
Yep.
So we need everyone on board with this.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we spend time thinking about like how we talk about transmission
Hmm.
to conservative states
Hmm.
and why they need it. And it's not necessarily just an IRA or a clean energy initiative, it's a
Hmm.
reliability issue. I mean, and another interesting fact is that when we look at the IRA and we know it was passed kind of down party lines, it's really a lot of the Republican conservative states that are benefiting from it because a lot
Hmm.
of these manufacturers are we often open up in the South and like
Yep.
the old Rust Belt, and they need transmission if they want those manufacturers to be there, if they want the jobs, the tax base, the
Right.
population.
Right.
This is something that we need. So really it's like it's that education piece, both
Hmm.
to the elected official but also the public. This should not be a partisan issue. This shouldn't be a D
I
or
agree.
an R issue.
Yep.
It should be something that we all just get on board with because it's again it's a life or death
Yeah.
necessity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I joke, I say I joke about it, but I've been vocal many times. And like, look, if you don't want to go back to candles, you need to solve this problem. I mean, because that's, and I don't know anybody who's like, yeah, man, let's do candles. So no, it's a great point that you raise. It's a human issue, really. If you think, I agree. It's something that I really hope that everybody can get on board with, because it impacts everybody, and it has, significant and severe consequences. And I think that most people I know really enjoy flipping that switch, the light coming on and their technology working and heat and air in their home. I mean, so all of that could be very, significantly compromised, as you mentioned. It's a possibility. And I think that's where, the education, and I don't think enough people know that. I don't think enough people understand the delicacy and intricacy of what we take for granted. And it's a big deal. So this is awesome. Look, I've loved talking to you today. This is fun.
It was fun.
I really appreciate you spending the time with us on the show and giving us your insights. I'm rooting for you. I mean, I think you got a great mission, and I'm hoping, we can iron some of these big issues out sooner rather than later. Because you're right. I mean, it's going to come to a head at some point. And hopefully we can assuage any real catastrophes, in the process. So the best way to get in touch with you, would you say, is on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I
Or
think that's right. Yeah,
just find you on
LinkedIn's good.
LinkedIn, and then
Yep.
just shoot you DM, that kind of thing, connection request. Okay,
Yes.
very good. All right. Well, I want to thank you for being on today's show, and I want to invite anybody else out there watching and listening. And if you're looking for an opportunity to get into the hot seat, Carrie got in there today and knocked it out. Hit us up at the show. You see it in the background, intergeniuspodcast.com. Until then, remember, there's a genius inside of all of us. It's up to you to discover it, harness it, and share it with the world. So the real question is, what's your inner genius?
This is the Padua Podcast Network. PaduaPodcastNetwork.com.